Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a prison sentence, but I didn't know my wife Rachel felt like an inmate until I overheard her confessing it to her book club. I work as a hydraulic systems engineer here in Cleveland, designing pressure systems for industrial equipment, and after 4 years of what I thought was a solid marriage, I decided to surprise Rachel by leaving work early on our anniversary with gifts I'd spent months planning. The custom-designed sapphire earrings had taken 3 consultations with a jeweler who specialized in unique settings, matching the exact shade of blue from her favorite vintage dress, and the tickets to New Zealand represented a dream vacation she'd mentioned exactly once during our 2nd year together when we watched a travel documentary. I pulled into our garage quietly around 7:30, wanting to keep the surprise intact and imagining her face when she saw how much thought I'd put into celebrating us. As I approached the kitchen door, I heard Rachel's voice carrying through the house with that particular slurred confidence that comes after too many glasses of the expensive Pinot Grigio she always insisted on buying for her monthly book club meetings. The sound of female laughter drifted through the door, and I could distinguish Emma's distinctive giggle, Jessica's snorting laugh, and Carla's more reserved chuckle mixed with Rachel's increasingly animated storytelling. I paused with my hand on the door handle when I heard Rachel say she could do so much better than her predictable husband who never took any risks, never surprised her, and had the romantic imagination of an engineering manual. She told them marriage felt like a prison sentence where she was trapped with someone who thought anniversary dinners at chain restaurants counted as special occasions. Then she confessed to fantasizing about Logan, her personal trainer at the expensive gym I paid for, describing in detail how his attention made her feel desirable and alive in ways I apparently never could. She painted a picture of stolen glances during workout sessions, lingering touches when he adjusted her form, and text messages that made her heart race in ways my engineering project updates clearly didn't. The worst part came when Emma asked why she didn't just leave me if she was so miserable, and Rachel laughed bitterly, explaining that I handled all the finances, paid off her graduate school debt every month without complaint, maintained our health insurance, and basically funded the comfortable lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She admitted that leaving me would mean giving up financial security for uncertain romance with someone who might not want to support her long-term, making me more useful as a husband than attractive as a man. I stood there in the garage holding anniversary gifts worth more than most people's monthly rent for a woman who saw me as nothing more than a reliable ATM with benefits, listening to her friends either laugh along or make sympathetic noises about being trapped with boring but financially stable men. Every word felt like a physical blow as I realized the woman I'd been planning to surprise with a once-in-a-lifetime vacation viewed our entire marriage as a financial convenience she was enduring while fantasizing about escape. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent months planning the perfect romantic gesture for someone who found my thoughtfulness suffocating rather than sweet, someone who craved spontaneity from a man whose methodical nature she'd once claimed to love. I quietly placed the jewelry box and plane tickets back in my car, my hands shaking slightly as the magnitude of her betrayal settled over me like cold water. I reversed out of the garage as silently as I'd arrived, backing down the driveway of the house where my wife was essentially celebrating the prison sentence of being married to me while I drove away into the night, wondering how long she'd been performing the role of loving wife while secretly counting down the days until something better came along. I drove straight to the luxury resort I'd booked for our romantic weekend getaway, but instead of checking into the couple's suite, I upgraded to the penthouse for one person and spent the night systematically dismantling our shared life with the same methodical precision I used for hydraulic system designs. The hotel's business center became my war room where I canceled joint credit cards, initiated transfers of my portion from our savings accounts, and used the concierge service to contact Thompson & Associates, a divorce attorney firm that specialized in asset protection for engineers and technical professionals. Each action felt like disconnecting pressurized lines in a complex system, carefully releasing tension before the whole thing could explode catastrophically. Meanwhile, back at home, Rachel discovered my absence around midnight when she stumbled upstairs after her book club friends finally left, assuming I was working late again on the Morrison project that had been consuming my evenings for weeks. She texted her complaints to the same friends who just heard her trash our marriage, whining about my workaholism and how I never made time for her anymore, completely oblivious that I'd heard every word of her betrayal just hours earlier. I watched her location pings on our shared phone plan as she moved around the house, probably wondering why I hadn't left my usual note about working late, never suspecting that I was 20 miles away planning our divorce while she slept in the bed we'd shared for 4 years. The next morning brought a cascade of carefully timed financial moves as I opened individual accounts, redirected my direct deposit, and began the process of legally separating assets I'd spent years building with someone who saw me as a convenient bank rather than a beloved husband. Rachel's morning routine proceeded normally according to her social media posts, sharing photos of her expensive coffee and complaining about Monday blues while tagging Logan in a gym selfie that made my stomach turn with fresh understanding of her true priorities. Around noon, Emma sent me a text message that changed everything, apologizing profusely for not defending me during the previous night's conversation and expressing her disgust at how Rachel had spoken about our marriage. She revealed that she'd seen my car leaving the driveway during the book club meeting and had been wrestling with whether to tell me what she'd witnessed, ultimately deciding that loyalty meant honesty even when it was painful. I responded only to thank Emma for her integrity and asked her to keep our conversation confidential, explaining that I needed time to process what I'd learned without Rachel knowing I'd overheard her confession. Emma agreed immediately, expressing her respect for how I was handling the situation and her hope that I would find someone who appreciated the kind of thoughtful partner I'd always been. The irony wasn't lost on me that Emma, who barely knew me beyond casual couple gatherings, could see my worth more clearly than the woman I'd been supporting emotionally and financially for 4 years. As the day progressed, I realized that my engineering background had prepared me perfectly for this kind of systematic problem-solving, treating the end of my marriage like a complex project that required careful planning, precise execution, and attention to detail rather than emotional explosions that would only create more damage for everyone involved. When Rachel finally called me in a panic Tuesday evening, her voice carried that particular edge of anxiety that came from discovering something was seriously wrong with her carefully controlled world. She demanded to know where I'd been and why I hadn't come home Monday night, claiming she'd been worried sick and had almost called the police to report me missing. I listened to her perform concern for about 30 seconds before calmly informing her that I'd heard every word she said about our marriage being a mistake and her fantasies about Logan during her book club meeting. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear her breathing change as the implications of what I'd said sank in, followed by the predictable attempt at gaslighting that started with nervous laughter and claims that she'd just been venting harmless frustrations with the girls. She insisted that everyone complained about their spouses sometimes and tried to minimize her confession as meaningless drunk talk that didn't represent her real feelings about our relationship. I let her dig deeper into her lies before explaining in the same calm tone I used for client presentations that I'd consulted Thompson and Associates about divorce proceedings and had already frozen our joint accounts since she'd expressed such clear dissatisfaction with being financially dependent on someone she found so inadequate. The mention of frozen accounts triggered immediate panic in her voice as she realized the full scope of what was happening, begging me to be reasonable and claiming she'd never meant any of the things she'd said about our marriage. She tried every manipulation technique in her arsenal, cycling through tears about how much she loved me, anger about my supposed overreaction to harmless gossip, and desperate promises to cut off all contact with Logan if I would just come home and talk through our problems like mature adults. Her desperation grew more obvious with each failed attempt to regain control of the situation, particularly when she realized that my eerily calm demeanor was far more terrifying than screaming or threats would have been. I explained with engineering precision that since she wanted freedom from what she'd called our prison of a marriage, I was simply unlocking the cell door and giving her exactly what she'd confessed to craving. When she started hyperventilating about the financial implications and begged for a chance to explain herself properly, I told her that explanations were unnecessary since her true feelings had been crystal clear during her drunken confession to friends who apparently knew more about her marriage dissatisfaction than her actual husband did. She tried one final desperate gambit, claiming that Logan had been pursuing her aggressively and she'd only been confiding in friends about unwanted attention, but the lie was so transparent that even she seemed to realize how pathetic it sounded. I ended the call by telling her that I'd be staying elsewhere indefinitely and that all future communication should go through my attorney, then hung up and blocked her number on every platform we'd ever used to communicate. Emma later sent me updates about Rachel's increasingly frantic attempts to reach me through mutual friends, describing how she'd spent the entire night crying and calling everyone we knew to find out if anyone had heard from me. The reports painted a picture of someone finally understanding the gravity of what she'd lost, but by then it was far too late for apologies or explanations because the woman who'd seen our marriage as a prison sentence had finally gotten her freedom, just not in the way she'd expected or wanted. Over the next 6 months, I threw myself into a complete life overhaul that felt like emerging from a cave I hadn't realized I'd been living in, while Rachel pursued Logan with the kind of desperate intensity that made everyone around them uncomfortable. My transformation started with powerlifting at a gym across town where nobody knew about my failed marriage, methodically building physical strength that somehow translated into emotional resilience as I watched my body change in ways that surprised everyone who'd known the softer version of me from my married years. I signed up for salsa dancing lessons on Tuesday nights, initially feeling awkward and self-conscious but gradually discovering a rhythm and confidence I'd never known existed, especially when my instructor Maria commented that I had natural grace for someone who claimed to have no dancing experience. The real breakthrough came when I started traveling solo to places Rachel had always dismissed as too adventurous or expensive, beginning with a hiking trip through Iceland that challenged every comfort zone I'd built during 4 years of predictable domesticity. Meanwhile, Rachel moved in with her sister after discovering that Logan's interest evaporated the moment she became emotionally available and financially dependent, leaving her stranded between the life she'd abandoned and the fantasy that had never been real. Emma kept me updated through carefully neutral messages about Rachel's increasingly obvious desperation as she tried to recreate the excitement she'd felt during their flirtation, not understanding that Logan had only been interested in the thrill of pursuing a married woman rather than dealing with the reality of an actual relationship. I got promoted to senior engineer with an $18,000 raise after successfully managing the Morrison project that had consumed so many of my evenings during the final months of my marriage, ironic timing that felt like the universe rewarding me for focusing on work instead of trying to save something that had already been dead. My dating life began almost accidentally when I met Sophie at a charity marathon I'd trained for during my physical transformation period, drawn to her genuine laugh and the way she talked about her work as a pediatric nurse with the same passion I felt for hydraulic system design. Rachel's attempts to contact me through mutual friends became increasingly pathetic as reports filtered back about her failed relationship with Logan, who'd apparently dumped her after 3 weeks of her clingy behavior and constant financial requests that reminded him why he preferred casual encounters to serious commitments. Sophie and I took things slowly, building a foundation of actual communication and shared interests that felt revolutionary after years of managing Rachel's emotional volatility and financial demands, discovering that healthy relationships involved 2 people supporting each other rather than one person funding the other's lifestyle while being taken for granted. I systematically removed myself from our old social circles, creating an entirely new life filled with hiking groups, dance classes, professional development seminars, and weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to visit but had avoided because Rachel found them boring or beneath her standards. The contrast became stark as Emma's updates painted a picture of Rachel struggling through a series of failed relationships with men who quickly grew tired of her expectation that romance should come with a financial support system, while I was building something authentic with someone who insisted on splitting every check and contributing equally to every plan we made together. 2 years post-divorce, I proposed to Sophie during a hot air balloon ride over the Napa Valley, having learned to be vulnerable and communicative in ways my first marriage had never taught me existed, watching her face light up with genuine surprise and joy rather than the calculating assessment I'd grown accustomed to seeing from Rachel. The proposal itself represented everything I'd learned about real partnership, with Sophie having mentioned months earlier that she'd always dreamed of seeing California wine country from above, a casual comment I'd filed away and turned into a memory we'd treasure forever. We had a small, intimate wedding ceremony in a garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean, attended only by close friends and family who genuinely celebrated our union rather than performing social obligations or networking opportunities like the elaborate affair Rachel had always envisioned for herself. The guest list deliberately avoided any connection to my past life in Cleveland, creating a clean slate celebration that focused entirely on the future Sophie and I were building together rather than trying to impress people who'd never truly supported my happiness anyway. Rachel, meanwhile, had struggled through a series of failed relationships and financial instability that led to her moving back with her parents in suburban Cleveland, working retail at a department store while trying to rebuild the credit score she'd destroyed during her post-divorce spending sprees. Emma's final update came through a mutual friend who'd seen Rachel at a local coffee shop, looking tired and defeated while scrolling through social media posts of other people's happy relationships, apparently having learned too late that emotional security couldn't be purchased with someone else's money. Sophie and I bought a house in Portland where I'd transferred to lead a new renewable energy project, choosing a neighborhood filled with young professionals and families who valued community involvement over material displays of wealth. Sophie opened her own pediatric practice in a clinic that served underprivileged families, pursuing her passion for helping children while building a business that reflected her values rather than chasing maximum profit margins like so many of her colleagues. Our relationship operated on complete transparency and mutual respect, with weekly financial meetings where we discussed everything from grocery budgets to retirement planning, creating the kind of partnership I'd never known was possible during my years of managing Rachel's impulsive spending and entitled expectations. We established traditions around shared goals rather than expensive displays, like Sunday morning farmers market trips where we'd plan meals for the week and discuss our individual career aspirations, supporting each other's dreams instead of competing for resources or attention. The house gradually filled with evidence of our equal partnership, from Sophie's medical journals mixed with my engineering publications on the coffee table to a kitchen where we both contributed cooking skills and cleaning responsibilities without keeping score or maintaining resentment. I discovered that love could be both passionate and stable, built on daily choices to prioritize each other's well-being rather than dramatic gestures designed to compensate for fundamental incompatibilities, finally understanding why my marriage to Rachel had felt like constant work rather than natural partnership. Our communication style developed organically around honesty and respect, with disagreements handled through calm discussion rather than emotional manipulation or financial leverage, creating a foundation that made both of us feel heard and valued instead of defensive or resentful. The contrast with my previous relationship became more apparent as Sophie and I navigated major decisions together, from career moves to family planning, always approaching challenges as teammates rather than adversaries competing for individual advantage within our shared life. Sophie and I welcomed our son James 18 months after our wedding, and I discovered a depth of love and protective instinct I never knew existed, realizing with startling clarity how shallow and self-serving my previous relationship had truly been. Holding James for the first time in the delivery room, watching Sophie's exhausted but radiant smile as she counted his tiny fingers, I understood that everything painful I'd endured with Rachel had been necessary to bring me to this moment with people who actually belonged in my life. The contrast became even more pronounced as I found myself naturally gravitating toward nurturing behaviors that would have been mocked or dismissed during my marriage to someone who saw emotional availability as weakness rather than strength. We created family traditions around simple pleasures rather than expensive displays, like Saturday morning pancake making where James would help measure ingredients while Sophie and I took turns reading him stories about adventures in far-off places we planned to visit together someday. I built a workshop in our garage where I crafted handmade furniture for James's nursery, rediscovering the satisfaction of creating something lasting with my hands while Sophie worked in her garden, teaching our son to identify different plants and explaining how things grow with patience and proper care. Our parenting philosophy developed naturally around consistency and emotional security, providing James with the kind of stable foundation I'd always wanted to create but had been unable to establish with someone who viewed commitment as imprisonment rather than partnership. Rachel learned about James's birth through mutual connections on social media, according to Emma, who reached out to congratulate me and mentioned that our former neighbor had seen Rachel at a Cleveland mall, looking devastated while staring at baby photos on her phone. The idea that Rachel was experiencing some kind of breakdown over my happiness felt surreal rather than satisfying, mainly because my new life was so fulfilling that her reaction seemed irrelevant to the joy Sophie and James brought to every ordinary day. I coached Little League Baseball on weekends, finding unexpected pleasure in teaching neighborhood kids the fundamentals of teamwork and sportsmanship, while Sophie volunteered at the local children's hospital, extending her nurturing instincts beyond our family to help other people's children heal and grow. Our house became a gathering place for friends who appreciated genuine hospitality rather than impressive entertaining, hosting potluck dinners where everyone contributed something homemade and conversations focused on meaningful topics rather than material acquisitions or social positioning. James's first words, first steps, and first attempts at independence filled me with wonder and protectiveness that made me grateful every day for the painful lessons that had led me away from someone incapable of building the kind of family environment where children could thrive. Sophie encouraged me to reconnect with old friends I'd lost touch with during my first marriage, helping me realize that Rachel had subtly undermined relationships she perceived as threats to her control, isolating me from support systems that might have helped me recognize her manipulative patterns earlier. We established financial priorities around James's future education and our family's long-term security, making decisions based on what would benefit our son rather than what would impress other people, creating the kind of stable foundation I'd always wanted to build but had never been able to establish with someone who prioritized immediate gratification over sustainable happiness. 4 years after our divorce, Rachel visited Portland for a job interview and accidentally encountered me, Sophie, and baby James at the Saturday farmers market where we'd established our weekly routine of teaching our son to pick out fresh fruit while planning family meals together. I was crouched down next to James's stroller, holding his tiny hand as he pointed excitedly at different apple varieties, explaining in the simplified language parents develop that red apples taste sweet while green ones are more tart, when I noticed someone standing motionless about 20 feet away, staring with an expression I couldn't immediately identify. Sophie was adjusting James's tiny sun hat against the morning sun while chatting with the vendor about which berries would be best for the smoothies she made every Sunday morning, her easy laughter mixing with James's delighted babbling as he discovered the different textures of peach skin versus plum skin. The scene represented everything I'd learned about genuine contentment over the past 4 years, the kind of ordinary happiness that comes from building a life with people who actually want to be there, sharing simple pleasures without keeping score or calculating personal advantage. When I finally looked up and recognized Rachel among the crowd of families and couples browsing the weekend market, our eyes met briefly across the bustling space filled with the sounds of children playing and vendors calling out their specials, and I saw only polite recognition on my part, not anger or pain or any of the complicated emotions she might have expected after everything we'd been through together. She looked smaller than I remembered, wearing clothes that suggested financial constraints rather than the designer labels she'd once considered essential to her identity, her face showing the kind of wear that comes from years of stress and disappointment rather than the confident glow I'd fallen in love with during our early dating period. I watched her take in the scene of my transformed life, seeing a version of her ex-husband she'd never known existed, someone who was relaxed and affectionate and completely present with his family instead of the tense, defensive person I'd become during our final years together when every interaction felt like negotiating a business transaction. James chose that moment to succeed in grabbing an apple twice the size of his hands, squealing with delight as he held it up for Sophie and me to admire, creating one of those perfect family moments that happen spontaneously when people genuinely enjoy each other's company rather than performing happiness for social media or external validation. Sophie noticed my distracted expression and followed my gaze, immediately understanding without needing explanation that the woman watching us represented my past, but instead of creating drama or demanding details, she simply moved closer and took my free hand while keeping her attention focused on James and his apple discovery. For Rachel, I realized, this encounter represented the final closure of a chapter where she learned the devastating difference between being loved despite yourself and being loved for who you truly are, watching the life she'd rejected flourish in ways she'd never imagined possible when she dismissed our marriage as a prison sentence. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds before I simply nodded politely in her direction, picked up my son, and continued shopping with Sophie, my attention immediately returning to our Saturday morning tradition of selecting ingredients for the week's meals while James contributed his own form of help by reaching for everything colorful within his grasp. As we moved toward the next vendor, James babbling happily about the different colors and shapes he was discovering, I felt only gratitude that Rachel had freed me to find people who treasured the very qualities she'd found suffocating, allowing me to become the father and husband I'd always had the potential to be with partners who recognized love as gift rather than burden.